Good evening. My name is Vivekanand Sondhi, and it's my pleasure as a trustee of ML Sondhi Trust to welcome you to today's function, where the ML Sondhi Prize for International Politics will be presented to the International Strategic and Security Studies Program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru. Let me briefly introduce you to the speakers for today's function. There is a handout there with more detailed descriptions, so I'll keep it short. Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi is the chairperson of the Professor M.L. Sondhi Memorial Trust and director of the M.L. Sondhi Institute for Asia-Pacific Affairs. Mrs. Sondhi has been a senior fellow at the Indian Council of Philosophical Research and also at the Harry Truman Institute for Peace at Hebrew University of Jerusalem. She has published several books and contributed articles to scholarly journals. She edited the journal Shakti and was a columnist for Asian Age and now occasionally writes for some of our national dailies. Ambassador Lalit Mansingh is, as all of us know, former Foreign Secretary. Currently he is associated with the International Crisis Group, the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network, World Cultural Forum. He's a diplomatic advisor to FICCI. He's involved in Track 2 diplomacy between India and Pakistan. He's a member of the non-official group of Friends of Sri Lanka. And here I have to say, etc., because Ambassador Mansingh's activities and associations cover so many areas and institutions. For the purpose of this function, I would like to add that Ambassador Mansingh is a fellow trustee of the M.L. Sondhi Memorial Trust. Dr. V. Siddharth is emeritus scientist at Defense Research and Development Organization, DRDO, where he worked directly with 4 scientific advisors to the Defense Minister over nearly 20 years. He has been twice consultant to the Ministry of External Affairs. Currently he is associated with National Institute of Advanced Studies and the Institute of Social and Economic Change, and also with the Aeronautical Society of India. Dr. Seshadri Chari is a familiar face on Indian television programs focusing on strategic and diplomatic issues. He is a former national convener, Foreign Affairs Cell of the Bharatiya Janata Party, and is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. He is a former editor of The Organizer. He is associated with various institutes and think tanks related to strategic studies and also education, including some of the institutes include Institute for National Security Studies, Forum for Strategic and Security Studies, and the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. And we welcome Dr. Rajaram Nagappa, who is representing today the International Strategic and Security Studies programs. Dr. Nagappa served as Associate Director in the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center, ISRO, and was later Professor at Anna University, Chennai. He is also taught at Technion Israel Institute of Technology. He is recipient of various awards, including the Astronautical Society of India Award, the Distinguished Alumnus Award of the Madras Institute of Technology, and DRDO's Agni Award for Excellence in Self-Reliance. Dr. Nagappa joined the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru in 2007 and currently heads the International Strategic and Security Studies program. So I'll stop here, and Mrs. Sondhi.
Welcome everybody. I thank you for taking time off and braving Delhi's traffic to attend today's function for presenting the M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics to the Institute of International Strategic and Security Studies program of the National Institute of Advanced Studies at Bengaluru. I join Dr. Vivekanand Sondhi in welcoming our guests, Shri Seshadri Chari, Director, International Affairs at the Institute for National Security Studies, our Trust Co-Chairperson and former Foreign Secretary, Shri Lalit Mansingh, Dr. V. Siddharth, Emeritus Scientist, DRDO, and of course, Dr. Rajaram Nagappa, who has come from Bengaluru to receive the prize on behalf of the ISSSP. Those who remember Professor Sondhi in this gathering will agree that he was not simply interested in India's foreign relations, he was passionate about them. Yet he did not allow this passion to obscure the clarity of his thought and judgment. One aspect which took up a good deal of his attention alongside Tibet, Eastern Europe, Israel, Southeast Asia, the Far East, indeed the entire Asia-Pacific region, was the tactical and strategic dimensions of India's national security. This matches with the ISSSB mission, and I quote from them, that current and emerging scenarios in the nuclear, missiles, and space domain have formed the core area of its research. From the start, Professor Sondhi was a strong advocate of nuclearization, and in 1966, he organized the very first national seminar on nuclear weapons and foreign policy at the Indian School of International Studies, which was then at Sapru House. George Berkovich, in his History of India's Nuclear Program, observes that till this seminar was held, there had been no systematic examination of India's nuclear weapons options. And Apratim Mukherjee, author of a forthcoming biography of Professor Sondhi, praises the seminar as a signal achievement from several angles. It looked at nuclear weapons in a global and regional strategic context. It examined political and technical issues. It attempted a realistic analysis of China's nuclear policy, and it analyzed the non-proliferation regime of the superpowers. The seminar participants noted that though the possession of nuclear weapons doesn't yield any direct offensive strategic advantage, they do have deterrent value and are an important marker of great power status. Most of them strongly recommended that India acquire nuclear weapons and publicly announce her intention to do so. This was in 1966, shortly after Dr. Homi Bhabha, the initiator of India's nuclear weapons program, died in the January 1966 plane crash on Mont Blanc. As of today, India's prevailing policy positions on nuclearization have been in place long enough for not many to be aware that the conclusions of that 1966 seminar were a challenge to the received wisdom of those times. To give you an example, an Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis publication of 1968 put forward some very complex arguments that rather than develop an independent nuclear deterrent, it would be preferable for India to convince the nuclear powers to abjure their nuclear weapons, while she herself would go in for deep shelters and evacuation facilities for the top echelons of the civil and military administration, which would ultimately give a stake to other powers to exercise deterrence on her behalf. This was then. And that was the atmosphere of those times. M.L. Sondhi, however, continued with his advocacy of nuclear weapons, and as member of the Parliament Consultative Committee on Atomic Energy and Foreign Policy in the late 60s, strongly argued for India to adopt an independent nuclear position. Again, in his 1972 publication, Non-Appeasement, A New Direction for Indian Foreign Policy, he wrote, India should not hesitate to demonstrate her high level of nuclear technology by preparing at the earliest a peaceful explosion of what is called the plowshare category. And India did indeed conduct her first nuclear test, regrettably from my point of view, named the Smiling Buddha, 2 years later in May 1974 at Pokhran. But it was to be another 24 years before Professor Sondhi could welcome the second set of Pokhran tests in 1998, which, as he saw it, did not preclude India's participation in a cooperative system of security. However, he was a critic of the no first use doctrine, which he described as, I quote, typical of the strategic deficiency that characterizes India's political and diplomatic landscape, unquote. Instead, he recommended cooperative-based security structures which can exclude arms race spirals. Now, despite this background, I must emphasize that Professor Sondhi was not a simple hawk. Alongside his campaign for nuclearization, in fact, a year before the Nuclear Policy Seminar in 1965, he was delegated by the Indian School of International Studies to attend the founding seminar of Peace and Conflict Studies in London, organized by the SIBA Foundation. I say founding seminar because although several scholars and professors of political science had been studying problems of war and peace through the centuries, this was a kind of baptismal celebration of the birth of peace as an academic subject in its own right. I mentioned just a few out of the galaxy of participants: Kenneth Boulding, Carl Deutsch, Herbert Marcuse, Harold Laswell, Justice Bert Rowling, Anatole Rappaport, Johann Galtung. After returning to India, Professor Sondhi carried on a crusade, if I may say so, for peace studies to be introduced into the academic curriculum. But established institutions are often slow to change their ways. And during his lifetime, he had to remain content with running his own courses on the subject. Today, however, peace studies form part of the curriculum not only of JNU, but of many Indian universities and institutes where several of his former students head peace programs or departments. In parentheses, I might add that Professor Sondhi was also an activist, deeply concerned with problems of communal, ethnic, or international conflict. An indefatigable campaigner for a friendlier neighborhood, he was one of the earliest advocates of a South Asian parliament. In other words, he was always exploring the possibility of workable, irenic solutions. And one of his last major efforts towards peace in the subcontinent was the landmark Indo-Pakistan Conference on the eve of the Agra Summit in 2001. And yet again, Professor Sondhi was well aware that the pervasive and latent dynamics of conflict, once set in motion, develop their own momentum and have to be dealt with ideally through diplomacy, certainly through deterrence or defense. He agreed with Raymond Aron when he said that nations must learn the art of using thermonuclear weapons on the diplomatic level in such a way that they will never have to use them at the military level. Or more popularly, we have to keep thinking peace while practicing prudence. In the mid-90s, Professor Sondhi had a stint as the head of Science Policy Center at JNU. I won't go into the details of how that came about, which is a story in itself, but just mention that with characteristic enthusiasm, he used the opportunity to add a scientific dimension to thinking about security and international relations. In 2000, he was appointed chairman of the ICSSR, where among the numerous seminars he organized was again one on nuclear weapons and India's national security. In the same year, principal scientific advisor to the government, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, appointed him member of the consultative group of departments on science and technology. Thus, whether in academic or political milieus, at JNU, in parliament, or other public forums, Professor Sondhi continued to express and expand his thoughts on security and peace-related issues. He enjoyed associations with several scientists and technologists. Professor P.S. Gill, Dr. George Sudarshan, Dr. Raghunath Mashelkar, science expositor A. Ranganathan, our fellow panelist, Dr. V. Siddharth, of course. He had a special relationship with Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam and was amongst those who advocated his name for becoming President of India. I remember several visits to Dr. Kalam's house in the Asiad village, sometimes with Dr. Y.S. Rajan, where he used to live in his characteristically simple and austere way, but always alive to his fingertips with enthusiasm and ideas. After Professor Sondhi passed, President APJ Abdul Kalam gave the first M.L. Sondhi Memorial Lecture, from which I quote, "Professor Sondhi's life and work was unified by a single passion, that India live up to the promise of its freedom movement and emerge as a strong but benign force in the family of nations. When he talked of nuclear weapons and India's national security, or when he talked of global terrorism, he was clearly aware of the necessity of interlinking science, technology, and the social behavior of nations. I continue the quote, he was a multidimensional personality. He understood science, he understood philosophy, he understood culture, and above all, he understood politics. He was a great Indian and a great human being. His association with bureaucracy, politics, the scientific community, and culture elevated him to be with visionary politicians in the national and international arena. He advocated that India should become an economically strong nation through the application of science and technology," unquote. And I can confidently say that were Professor Sondhi present here today, he would be just delighted by the multidisciplinary self-description of the ISSSP, which is part of the School of Conflict and Security Studies at NIAS. I quote, I read from their own write-up. The emphasis of research is towards integrating complex elements of science and technology with political science, international relations, economics, and policy analysis. Rapidly changing geopolitical and technology development and adaptation affect the national and international security and strategic conditions, and the research carried out in the program reflects this. Current and emerging scenarios in the nuclear, missiles, and space domain are reflective of such an impact and have formed the core area of research. The Institute is unique in its integrated approach to the study of intersections between science and technology, philosophy, social, and policy issues. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you, Madhuri, for inviting me to say a few words. After that extensive introduction of the broad spectrum and depth of Professor M.L. Sondhi's interests and concerns, and drive to get those interests and concerns into some elements of policy making and policy implementation, I've had to tread, I suppose, quite carefully in more ways than one when I was coming here to the podium. I have, of course, privileged to be invited to say some words, and by way of introduction, really, of the program rather than of the speaker. But I've known, excuse me, I've known Radharam since the time we were together sometimes on the other side of a table at Vikram Sarabhai Space Center. One particular aspect which I think I should like to say right away, lest I don't have the time to say it later, is that Professor Rajaram Nagapak is a very quiet, unassuming kind of person. But please be aware that he is, in fact, the designer of the world's third largest solid propellant rocket motor, namely the first stage of the PSLV, which is only the third largest after the booster stages of the space shuttle of the United States and the Titan 3C. It wasn't easy, but it has led to eventually the build and a launch of, I don't know, I've forgotten the number of successful launches of the PSLV, which is now a workhorse, not only for Indian satellites, but also of foreign ones as well. Then I remember, from the point of view of Professor M.L. Sondhi, that memorable date on the May 11th, 1998, when both Madhuri and Professor Sondhi quickly visited me just across from Lodi Estate in Bharatinagar, where I lived, and announced to me the nuclear tests somewhat excitedly. And that dramatic event marked a decisive culmination of an extended period traceable to as early as 1946, actually, since when there have been many events and decisions, but not so dramatic ones as 1998, at the confluence or intersection of our capabilities in science and technology, national security, and our international engagements. The subject matter, in fact, of one of the most unique institutions and institutional study groups in the country today, namely the I3SP. I call it I3SP for short, at the National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bengaluru. Now, how an international relations imperative, and at this time in the space domain, was very deftly handled by Indira Gandhi, provided a lesson, actually, and it does provide a lesson for our manned space mission, which was announced somewhat dramatically again by the Prime Minister from the ramparts of the Red Fort. There was, in fact, an offer by Leonid Brezhnev for such a mission made to Mrs. Gandhi. And a perspicacious decision by Indira Gandhi to get the Indian Air Force to handle the mission enabled both the foreign policy imperative and the scientific one of not wrenching our still nascent space program out of shape to be satisfied. I'd like to spend a minute on that because it's a matter that seems to animate the present as well, because of the discussions with the Russians, and so I might want to spend a minute on that. When this was mooted, Professor Satish Dhawan, the real father of our Indian space program, by the way, and I'll go into that in case there are questions afterwards, made it very clear that if that happened, then the existing space program that we had, the autonomy of that space program would be destroyed and it would become a handmaiden of some other country. And please do not do this. However, and this is where that comes into the geopolitics, at that time, the geopolitical situation was such that Indira Gandhi was not in a position actually to reject that offer, which was made in very different geopolitical circumstances. And so she found a way. And the way was to get the Indian Air Force, at that time the chief of the Indian Air Force was Idris Latif, to make the arrangements necessary, which included upgrading some of the facilities at the Institute of Aviation Medicine, the centrifuges and so on, human centrifuges and so on, at the Institute of Aviation Medicine in Bengaluru, which is now located in what is now the old airport. In such a way that both us were satisfied, the geopolitical circumstances were satisfied, and so also our own scientific ones, so as to ensure that our drive towards self-reliance in our own space program was not compromised in any way. There are some questions about whether our present decision to go in for a manned space mission was wise or not, but we can come to that later perhaps. Now, this confluence of geopolitics and space was in fact elaborated on a very long time ago. In 1988, as a matter of fact, by Professor Satish Dhawan, in his pioneering KPS Menon Memorial Lecture. And the KPS Menons have a very long history of being involved with our Indian Foreign Service. I've forgotten how many generations, probably 3. And in his memorial lecture in Andhra Bhavan, Space and Foreign Policy, S. Chandrasekhar, who is a member of the I3SP team at NIAS today, contributed very extensively to the preparation of that lecture. It's available, and for those of you who are interested, I think arrangements can be made to have that distributed around. And Dhawan's lecture animated and shaped a 2-week course that was held at the National Institute of Advanced Study in March this year on space and India's foreign policy, which was a 2-week course. A large number of people, particularly from the services, attended, about which Professor Nagappa will probably talk a little more. In the long list of studies that they have recently done is one on China and Chinese capabilities in military-related space, and a lamentation at the end of that study, also produced by Chandrasekhar, that unless we engage rather seriously with the military users of space, we are going to be in very serious trouble, for one specific reason that I am adducing now, that the world will not leave us alone even if we want to be left alone. We're too big for that. And for that reason, if for no other, we need to calibrate our military presence in space much the same way as was adduced by Professor M.L. Sondhi when he advocated nuclearization. I don't have a great deal more to say, except perhaps to add at this point that in the manner in which we integrate science and technology, foreign policy, and national security, we have an opportunity, in fact, to ensure that we do not export the same sort of neocolonialist mentality to countries which are below us, quote unquote, in rank in respect of science and technology, which incidentally we are the best and we are the top of all the post-colonial countries, with one exception, which is China. But China, as you know, is a post-revolutionary society, an advantage we have not had, at least not yet. So I'd like to end at that point to invite Professor Radharanamba, the designer, as I said, of one of the world's third largest rocket motors, to deliver on behalf of NIASA's program his speech in acceptance of the M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics. Thank you very much.
That's okay. No, don't worry. Thank you, Dr. Siddharth, for the wonderful lecture and introduction to the program. I think now we'll do the presentation.
This is heavy, you have to carry it. So you can keep it in.
Now we'll present the check to Dr. Nagappa. Thank you. Now I'll ask Dr. Chari to give some remarks, presidential remarks.
Respected Madhuri ji, Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, Dr. Siddhartha, and Dr. Nagappa, Vivekanand, and friends. It's such a pleasure being here and remembering Dr. M.L. Sondhi after quite some time. In fact, there have been occasions when I was on the other side of the mic, because listening to Dr. Sondhi and also listening about him was always a pleasure. So when Madhuri ji called me for this function, I was pleasantly surprised. So I readily, of course, I agreed. I said I'm traveling and I'm not in Delhi, but I'm surely going to be in Delhi on that day for this function. Then very slowly, when I confirmed that I'm going to be here, she told me that you will have to be on the wrong side of the mic. So now I realize how wrong I am on this side. But of course, when I think of those exciting days, which was explained by Dr. Srinivas, sir, Dr. Siddharth. I came in contact with him before 92, of course, but as a great leader of my former party, Janasangh, Bharatiya Janasangh. So we used to read about him and listen to him. So whenever he used to come to give lectures, he used to say we should become a great nuclear power and we will all clap, and we didn't know what actually he says and what he means and all that. But whatever he says is something great, that's all. When in 1992, when I became the editor of Organizer, one of the first few names that was told to me to be in the list was Dr. Sondhi. So it was quite a treat for me to wanting to meet him. But then those were not the days of mobile and all that. So suddenly somebody from my office, and our office was in Jhandewala, in quite a dilapidated building that time. Beyond Jhandewala, in fact, near the Eidgah, because we could not pay the rent, so we had to give up the office. And at that time, my former editor, who used to come once in a month, Professor Bhatia, VP Bhatia, he once told me that आप कल ज़रूर आइए और एक बहुत बड़े व्यक्ति मिलने के लिए आने वाले हैं, मैं आपको उनका परिचय कराऊंगा. So in fact, all those people who came to meet Professor Bhatia and even earlier the editor before him was K.R. Malkani, and in between Lal Krishna Advani was the editor. So when everyone who comes to Organizer office is always of some stature. So I never asked him who it is going to be. But then when suddenly this man appeared, tall, hefty figure, I was really stunned. Then he said, he didn't, of course we had not met personally, so I didn't, I was not introduced to him. But he said, नहीं मैंने आपके बारे में सुना है, बेटे. And then it started. It was not a meeting between the editor and one of his writers. It was a meeting between a boss dictating what is to be done next. Next issue, I am going to send this article, you publish it. I have already spoken to Mr. Bhatia. Of course, he is no longer the editor, but that is immaterial for M.L. Sondhi. He said, I am going to send it to you. It will be more than 800 words. But if you don't have space, take it into 2 programs. But in those days, we never had advertisement, so we had enough space. And he knew that, of course. And this is how the whole program started. So, some of the most beautiful articles, wonderful pieces, ideas, everything. And then casually the meeting started. So this was the kind of programs. And in between, of course, he would suggest so many things, and given the parameters of the organization to which I was belonging, it was very difficult for me sometimes to digest all those, much less even inform my seniors. So you would frankly say that we only talk of so many things, we do nothing. So what scientific temper you are talking about? This is what we should have done and we have not done this. So it would be very uncomfortable for me to hear that, and more uncomfortable even to print it. But I did carry all those articles that he wrote. And then he used to discuss so many things. So now when we look back, we really feel, of course, we have stalwarts of foreign policy here. So it would not be very appropriate to say it now. But the most important aspect was the confluence of science, technology, and international relations. So I think it was Dr. Raja Ramanna who started this program of International Strategic Studies program in 1994, if I'm not mistaken, 96. Because I am associated with Manipal University now, it's called MAHE. Ironically, the government has said all private universities are not supposed to use the name university. I don't know for what reason. So we have converted into MAHE from Manipal. So Dr. Arvind Kumar, incidentally, who was one of the first directors, is now the head of the Department of International Relations. So when we were discussing all these things, he said, see, we are discussing so many things. Then I told him, these are some of the things that I have published as an editor of Organizer and one written by M.L. Sondhi. And that time, of course, you had not called me. So I didn't even know this. So that was the whole strange story. So the whole idea that he used to talk about in those days was how science and technological advancement is going to really determine how nations are going to deal between them. If you see the whole gamut of the First World War and the Second World War, First World War was like the extent of colonies, the strength of the colonies that you used to have, and how many countries that you hold as your colony you can commit to the war, who will stand by your side, was what determined the strength of the countries. And then the Second World War, and then the nation states. And then what determined the second outcome of Second World War was the strength of the army that you have. And how much of the strength of your army you can really commit, who can stand on your side and who can win the war for you. Then came a long period of ideology which dominated the international relations. East versus West, communist versus non-communist bloc. And in that came in the introduction of technology. Sputnik versus Apollo, and then the space programs, Russian space program and the American space programs. It was in this kind of a situation that people like M.L. Sondhi played an important part in actually determining the footprints of India's scientific, technological innovation and how it is going to really relate to foreign policy and international relations. So when we today think in terms of dealing with the US and Russia at the same time, buying S-400 from Russia and at the same time not stepping on the toes of Washington, it is nothing but a mixture of science and technology and understanding the nuances of technological advance and implementing it in international relations. So diplomacy is all about understanding this technological progress and this technological strength that a nation gets. So this kind of changeover which has come, a recalibration of the foreign policy in this last few years, few decades, is a phenomenal subject which really calls for an independent study. And to imagine that someone in the 60s and 50s was actually talking this language and actually writing about it. So that is the kind of colossus that we all have today. And as Madhuriji very rightly pointed out, he would be very happy if he had known that a time would come when his ideas would really materialize and see the light of the day. And not only that, practitioners of diplomacy, practitioners of foreign policy, and practitioners of science and technological advancement would all sit together as one group and think in terms of national self-interest. So this kind of a situation which has come today is really one of the best tributes that we can pay to Dr. M.L. Sondhi. Of course, I am very much aware of the fact that considering the galaxy of people present here, I am the junior most to speak on any of these subjects. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chari, for your wonderful remarks. I now invite Dr. Rajaram Nagappa to deliver his lecture to us today. Thank you.
Mrs. Madhuri Santanam Sondhi, Chairperson Professor M.L. Sondhi Memorial Trust and Director of the M.L. Sondhi Institute of Asia Pacific Affairs, Ambassador Lalitman Singh, and Dr. Sheshadri Chari, Dr. Siddhartha, Sri Vivekananda Sondhi, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. It is indeed a great privilege and honor for me to accept the M.L. Sondhi Prize for International Politics for the year 2017 on behalf of the International Strategic and Security Studies Program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies. Being in Bangalore, we are located away from Delhi. We are not very visible. Our research efforts and outcomes are accessed by select and interested researchers and readers. Notwithstanding this, the fact that our contributions have been recognized makes this award very, very special to us. I am deeply grateful to Mrs. Madhuri Sondhi, the trustees of the foundation, and members of the selection committee for doing us this honor. And this is a great support and encouragement for our work, and I'm grateful to the selection committee members and to Mrs. Sondhi for this. At this point, I'd also like to remember and pay tribute to our late director, Dr. Baldev Raj. Dr. Raj took a lot of interest in our work, very keen interest in this one. He was constantly encouraging us to take on new challenges. He would have been extremely proud of this recognition. When I look at the past recipients of the Sondhi Memorial Prize, I feel both happy that I'm in very august company, or my program is in very august company, and at the same time a little bit humble also, because to be counted among greats, I think we need to live up to much more of an expectation. Among the recipients, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Abdul Kalam very closely in the development of India's first satellite launch vehicle. Dr. Ashley Tellis had visited NIAS to deliver a public lecture, and we had very useful interaction with him. Dr. Baldev Raj, after a lot of search, has decided that His Holiness the Dalai Lama should be conferred the Distinguished Fellowship of the NIAS. And in fact, His Holiness was the first Distinguished Fellow of NIAS. And he had come to NIAS in that context in December 2015. And my colleague Subha Chandran was director of the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, and I find IPCS is also among the recipients of the award. On my own side, I am a late entrant to the field of strategic studies and did not have the privilege of meeting and knowing Professor Sondhi. After listening to his contributions here, after reading about it from all the people here, it's been my great loss, I should say, that our paths did not cross. During the time Professor Sondhi was active in diplomacy, I academics, prolific writing. I was active in designing and developing solid propellant rockets, which Siddhartha mentioned to some extent, which power ISRO's launch vehicles. And I think I was very, very rare visitor to Delhi, I should say. I used to spend more time in Sriharikota and Trivandrum. And as I said, I missed knowing such an eminent thinker, such a multifaceted personality. Besides the economy inside which I heard here today, I have colleagues from JNU who are working with me, and they have been telling me what an eminent thinker he was, what an erudite teacher he was, and what a prolific writer he was. Among his prolific writings, I found Professor Sondhi had devoted time active to space, to Indian Ocean area, China, nuclear issues, of which we already heard quite a lot of it, and all these issues are relevant and still actively pursued by NIAS. I was looking around, I was speaking to my colleague, friend, good friend Rajan, and Rajan said he was good enough to share a poem he had written with in 2003. And I find Professor Sondhi's persona is best captured in this poem. Rajan wrote, I quote, "Our nation was his passion, its future did he try nurture, swords did he yield of fiery words, scars many adorned him from his wars, his breadth of mind was galactic depth, his humanism killed all pessimism, his network resembled Prakriti's handwork. Missionary was he with thoughts revolutionary," unquote. Rajan tells me, and I think it's been stated over and over again here also, Professor Sondhi's thoughts were futuristic, quite ahead of the times. The prescriptions he made those days, I think we have followed, some of them have been followed, some are yet to be taken up. Therefore, the content of today's talks are an appropriate tribute to this great thinker, I feel. The pace of technology advance, the pace of its absorption and application has gone through a sea change, and it becomes a relevant topic for continuous study and employment by nations for best serving their purpose. The overlaps of technology on security and policy, which become an essential component of study and practice. In that sense, it jives well with the thoughts and works of Professor Sondhi, whom we are honoring this evening. Siddhartha mentioned a little bit about what we do in the International Strategic and Security Studies program at NIAS. We found that enough think tanks are there which do yeoman work. There's no point one more think tank doing the same thing. And as it was mentioned, Raja Ramana started in '96 looking at the policy and science, this one. And it's more in the 2005 onwards where we said we should slightly make a total change. And we start looking at science and technology perspective as a means to look at political happenings. So we look at security issues from an S&T perspective, but reinforce it with geopolitical and structural aspects. And towards this, I have colleagues with background in technology. Till recently, I should say, fortunately only, most of the colleagues have come from a space background. Actually, 4 of us are this one, but I have now added people with aeronautics and electronics background also. But we have to also, in addition, we have people with background in defense studies, political science, international relations, and we make quite a homogeneous mix where we can look at both the policy and the technology overlaps. Some of the work done in our program, I can claim with some modesty, are path-breaking. We were perhaps the first in the country to verify the feasibility of an anti-ship ballistic missile. We could establish that using a constellation of intelligence gathering and Earth observation satellites, ground tracking facilities, and modifications to the missile system, it is possible to locate, identify, and target an aircraft carrier. We have used open source images from space to study critical locations. My colleagues have developed techniques to identify a uranium mill using space imagery. We also use publicly available images of missiles to derive its dimensions and estimate its performance. Our in-house developed trajectory software allows an independent assessment of the missile range capabilities. In this connection, we have done serious work and commentary on missile capabilities of North Korea, mostly done by my good colleague Chandrasekhar. Our work on rare earths catalyzed broader and deeper discussion within the country and among specialist agencies in the country towards enunciating a national approach for special and critical materials. We have also carried out substantive study on Myanmar and on borderland areas. And our current ongoing studies and initiatives relate to maritime domain awareness, Southeast Asia, peace research, which was mentioned about, which is taken up, plan to take up to some extent. We just started the initiative, we inaugurated it. Science diplomacy, advanced weapon systems, and weapon systems as how do you apply it as a deterrent strategy. Most of our work and publications are available on the program website. In addition, we hold formal and informal discussions with specialists and specialist organizations on a regular basis. We are attractive dialogue partners with the Committee on International Security and Arms Control, a constituent of the US National Academy of Sciences. And with this academy, we have had very fruitful discussions on issues of nuclear and missile proliferation, space security, terrorism, and other contemporary topics. Let me now try to address the technology perspectives and national security. I am not very conversant still with the strategic, this one overlaps to a large extent. Siddhartha has mentioned a few of them, but I'll try to look at some of the elements. It's no uncommon knowledge, if I may say so, that inventions and discoveries are done with noble and altruistic intentions. But it is the inherent nature of humankind to override these intentions and adapt the S&T output to strategic application. History is replete with examples. The advantage of standoff distance was evident to the prehistoric man, for both killing his prey or to defeat adversaries. Common sense technological tools like spear, the bow and arrow, the catapult, these enabled and empowered our strategic usage. Similarly, to mimic the birds and take to the air has been another fascination of humankind. Story of wings created by Daedalus for his son Icarus out of feathers and wax is well known. Later balloon flights of heavier than air machines were towards new inventions, experimentation, exploration and adventure. But strategic advantage of a larger view from a height was not lost, and soon use of aircraft for surveillance, followed by its use as a weapon platform, emerged. I'd like to examine how technology has reshaped our strategic percepts in relation to two technology elements. One, I'd like to look at ballistic missiles, and two, at space. If time permits, I may briefly touch upon unmanned air systems and cybersecurity. I am not competent in these last two topics especially, so I'd just like to touch upon it. Post-World War II saw major activity in the development and testing of nuclear weapons. The US was first off the block in 1945 and carried out between 1945 and 17 nearly 1,000 tests or exceeding 1,000 tests with yields ranging from kiloton to megaton range. The former Soviet Union started testing in 1949. They also developed a whole range of weapon systems trying to match the USA one for one. UK in 1952, France in 1960, China in 1964 made their entry into the nuclear club. Tests were carried out in the atmosphere, under the sea, and in outer space. The early nuclear weapons were designed for aircraft delivery. A man-in-the-loop provided both advantages and disadvantages. One major advantage being a certain level of recall capability. Aircraft had to fly over hostile airspace to reach their targets and were vulnerable to ground air and air interception. Carried by missile removed this vulnerability to a large extent. A ballistic missile has a major part of its flight above the atmosphere, where the concept of airspace perhaps does not exist. Additionally, the missiles be unmanned. Despite these advantages, India was a late starter to missile development. Even if the outcome of Pokhran-1 had been converted to a weapon system, it was essentially a physics package. It had been converted. We did not have a suitable delivery platform. By 1974, we had an active civilian program, and there is commonality between many elements of a launch vehicle and a missile system. However, in the higher echelons of the government, connecting the dots either did not happen or was plainly not considered. This is not surprising when portfolios are under different ministries and have different mandates and priorities. And in India, this connecting the dots in many places we seem to miss out. A special weapons development team had been formed in the Defense Science Lab to take up design and development of guided missiles in the early 1960s. The Special Weapon Development Team, SWTT as it was called, was a predecessor of the Defense Research and Development Laboratories, and in the coming years initiated development studies, creation of fabrication and testing infrastructure in Hyderabad. However, serious development efforts started only with the sanction of the Integrated Guided Missile Development Program, IGMDP, in 1983 under the leadership of Dr. Abdul Kalam. An obvious question that comes to mind is why the technology gains made in the launch vehicle program were not leveraged adequately for accelerating the IGMTP outcomes. It is perhaps useful to recollect a few key milestones. The first successful launch of SLV-3 took place on 18 July 1980. An year earlier, an attempt had been made and that was not successful. IGMTP was sanctioned in 1983, and the Agni re-entry technology demonstrator was a major element of this program. The first launch of augmented satellite launch vehicle took place in March 1987. MTCR, the Missile Technology Control Regime, came into being just 1 month later in April 1987. ISRO centers, ISRO work centers, DRDO centers, academic institutions, aerospace research laboratories all found mention under the US entity list and were subject to embargoes. Agni re-entry technology demonstrator flight took place on 22nd May 1989, almost a decade after the SLV-3 flight. After the launch of SLV-3 in 1980, a certain tightening in imports from the US was experienced and had started becoming an acute by the time we launched the augmented satellite launch vehicle. In terms of international relations, the Indian government could not prevail upon the United States that the civilian program of the launch vehicles is not connected with the country's missile program, and ISRO entities should not figure in the embargo list. However, ISRO's further pressurization of the center and discussion with the US eased the embargo pressure, and only the ISRO Satellite Center was taken off the embargo list. Other ISRO centers continued to be embargoed. But this removal of the ISRO Satellite Center also came with its own price. That is, the technical exchange or facilitation between ISRO and DRDO had to be totally stopped. Same country, same this one, the international relations prevented us to discuss with DRDO, or technical cooperation was barred. In later years, provisions of the MTCR were used by the US to deny India the transfer of Russian cryogenic engine technology. Cryogenic engines are not suitable for missile applications, but technology transfer related to propulsion and vehicle stage is prohibited under MTCR. The US used this provision to prevail upon Russia to cancel the technology transfer, and a financially dependent Russia gave in under US pressure. It must be noted that US was wary of the fact ISRO launch vehicles, when fully developed, would offer cost competition to the US. They do offer cost competitions. ISRO launch vehicles are cheaper. They can put payload at a cost lower than the US expendable launch vehicles, except the new ones that are coming in. I'll touch upon it a little bit later. It thus made sense for US to delay the Indian launch vehicle development efforts. It must also be noted that US embargoes could not and did not cause technology disruptions either in the Indian space program or in the missile program to a large extent. We found indigenous solutions of our own, but there were development delays. India's no first use policy necessitates certain technology-enabled capabilities. Also, for effective deterrence, one must possess demonstrated capabilities. Hence, the need for missile of diverse capabilities and testing to qualify them. I recall in the earlier years, the DRDO missile would be ready, but the political clearance for launching them would come looking at whether it will cause more sanctions, less sanctions, what is the economic this one, who will feel offended. So these were factors, even if technology we had gained, we had to wait till the political clearance was coming in. And maybe therefore the diplomatic efforts to say why we are doing such a test and all that had to be done, and it is still connected, I feel. I think there could be certain ease of things, but then still any major launch is perhaps requires a political clearance, and political clearance looks at the international ramifications of these studies. Now, strategic missile again therefore need to be dispersed for absorbing a first strike and then launch retaliatory strike. Mobility, keeping the missile in a canister in a ready-to-launch status becomes useful. And the best second strike capability is achieved through a sea-based system. Therefore, the necessity of developing submarine-launched ballistic missiles. An obvious need would be to develop capability to defend against incoming missiles, and hence the development of anti-ballistic missile system goes hand in hand. Unfortunately, we are not the only ones who think in these lines, and other countries which want to develop such technologies, they also look at it. But how do they do it? They resort either to indigenous development or go for clandestine deals or tie on with a country which is willing to sell or provide them technology either for money or for strategic gains. Two elements of international relations come into play. One relates to missile technology proliferation and related actions. In our region, missile proliferation has happened for technology exchange purposes, for earning foreign exchange, for promoting my adversary is my best friend syndrome. For countries like India, precious little can be done to arrest the trend when the proliferator is powerful and deliberately ignores or delays applying proliferation norms. The recipient country has nothing to complain about in acquiring sensitive technology that enables it to reach a level of parity with its adversary countries. Even countries which are in a position to influence the proliferation norms do precious little based on their own national interests and the prevailing circumstances. At some level, after the proliferation has reached this one, policy and bilateral relations tend to see whether some stability can be reached and some equilibrium is achieved. And this equilibrium stays as long as actions and strategic communication lead to some level of acceptance and they are not of serious destabilizing nature. And confidence discussion, bilateral discussion, confidence building measures like exchange of information of strategic installations, pre-launch notification of ballistic missiles add to such a stability. We could explore further confidence building measures in this area. The second relates to a new weapon system that's under development. This is called the hypersonic glide vehicle. And this system travels at hypersonic speeds, that is at 5 to 8 times the speed of sound. It is highly maneuverable, possesses ambiguity of intent. We don't know whether it will be carrying a strategic weapon or a conventional warhead. It also carries an ambiguity of destination. It is so maneuverable, it can be headed towards one direction, towards the last moment you can change its direction. So therefore it can be highly destabilizing because of these ambiguities and for lack of defense against such high-speed weapons. There is a debate going on in some Western circles whether the test of this system should be banned. I think we need to consider whether we should be banned for India because hypersonic technologies also find a place in the civil space missions. And also, there is a possibility this technology developed in one country could proliferate to another country and put you at a loss. A debate on the pros and cons of developing hypersonic weapons will be timely, in my opinion. The second aspect of technology I wish to talk today relates to space. The dependence on space for a number of commercial and strategic activities is increasing day by day. Extensive use of space assets by US in the conduct of their Gulf War, the Desert Storm, was an eye-opener for other nations. Other militaries, especially China, are leveraging space increasingly in their defensive and offensive plans. Over time, with dint of hard work, mix of indigenous and procured technologies, creative and innovative planning, and most importantly, forward-looking leadership, India today has demonstrated all-round capabilities in implementing end-to-end missions of diverse nature, including commercial revenue-earning missions. ISRO's fleet of remote sensing satellites can provide imagery with sub-meter resolution. Its fleet of communication satellites provides services in a number of bands. Its navigation satellites provide regional position and timing. Meteorological services are another important output. In addition, ISRO has carried out and has plans for further deep space missions and scientific missions. And finally, it has also now embarked on human spaceflight missions. ISRO has cooperative engagements with many international space agencies, and there are important and critical space and foreign policy interactions. Many space applications are of dual-use nature. Dr. Siddhartha was instrumental in some serious discussions relating to space and foreign policy overlaps. And as he mentioned, we conducted one course which was attended. We are planning another course this year also, and this will be a regular affair. I think we'll be examining many issues there, and I'm happy to say this topic is today viewed with some element of seriousness. In the year 2010, my colleague Chandra and I had made an assessment of India's space assets. The figure turned out to be about $23 billion. For this, we had factored in then availability of 211 transponders, 7 Earth observation satellites, weather and met services, space transportation services, and ground infrastructure. Since then, space activity and capacity has increased multifold. Today, India has a sizable constellation of operational satellites. Nearly 42 satellites are operating today. If I recall, I think we have 15 communication satellites, 7 Earth observation satellites, and additionally the navigation satellites. So roughly about 42, if I recall, that's my memory. We've also placed 240 satellites from 28 countries in the country, and in the country ISRO has 84 major clients using its communication services. ISRO's commercial arm Antrix have reported earnings of 5,600 crores. Why I'm just giving the status is the $23 billion assessment we have made in 2010 must have, in my opinion, on a gross level, expanded 3 to 4 times. That is our capability today. In terms of money, it must have gone up to almost close to $100 billion. The demands are also more increasing, and ISRO is making, in fact, a small satellite launch vehicle exclusively to meet the small satellite launch market, which is going to be about 50 to 60 launch vehicles. So overall, our space assets are going to increase more and more, and our dependence on space for many operations will come in, and this includes the military requirements. Somewhere, I think Japan and India are perhaps the only 2 countries where space started as a civilian topic. Most other countries, whether you take USA, Russia, China, wherever they tell, it's an offshoot of the military program. So the question therefore comes is, how safe are our space assets? Militarization of space has happened with the beginning of space age. The dual-use nature of space permitted applications related to defense and security purpose as well as for resource survey and management of natural resources. Satellite applications involving communication, surveillance, reconnaissance, navigation, and weather are useful for both civilian societal applications as well as for military purposes. The two superpowers use their space assets for verifying the implementation of SALT and ABM treaties. And these two powers, those days, because they were the only two superpowers, if they agreed to a certain things, it could perhaps convert to a certain international type of obligation and binding rules. And they had done tests in the atmosphere, had experienced the deleterious effects of doing such tests, and agreed we'll ban tests in this one. And between them, when they agreed, there was the emergence of an international space order, and UN treaties and principles on outer space emerged. This is no longer true anymore. The international space scenario is undergoing major changes. Now there are a large number of countries deriving benefits from space. In 2016, the government expenditure the world over on space totaled about $62 billion. And there were about 70 countries with government space spending in excess of $1 million. Within a decade, this is expected to rise to about 81 countries. But what I'd like to bring here is in this large $62 billion, among the bigger countries, approximately 45 to 50% of the expenditure is towards military space. And there are a number of private players now entering space business. It is now therefore realized that one need not depend upon large satellites. Small satellites can provide practical and useful inputs. And some of these small satellites constellations are very large. The US company OneWeb is planning a constellation of 900 satellites to provide global internet connectivity. Another company called Planet Labs wants to plan a constellation of 175 satellites to provide 3-meter resolution imagery every day. So these and other players too are going to increase the number of space objects to a very large extent. And today, the population in space is of the order of 19,000 objects, out of which many are defunct, spent stages, and non-functional payloads. So this large debris, as we call them, are in a low Earth orbit where nearly half of our own operational satellites are going to be situated or already situated, and they are in a major danger space. And there are serious demands and constraints on space resources like orbital slots and radio frequency requirements. The result is space today is congested, contested for limited resources, and could be a source of future potential conflict. Even in this, some abuses have happened or likely to happen also. There are known instances of jamming of GPS signals. Paper satellites are created to book orbital slots. Radio interference takes place. Frequencies have been utilized for purposes other than allotted. There have been accidental and intended collisions among space objects. With the large space debris right now, can prove to be a hazard to other operational satellites. Just imagine a debris traveling at 8 kilometers per second speed. If it collides with a live satellite, it can do very serious damage. In addition, in 2007, the anti-satellite test carried out by China and the other demonstration carried out by America to bring down a rogue, ineffective satellite showed are indicative of weaponization trends in space. The USA, China, Russia have been increasingly using satellites whose objectives can only be conjectured. These satellite applications could be for very genuine technology development purposes, but all countries are worried, could their intended purposes also be for inspection or for spying or for use as space weapons? The US X-37B, the Chinese SY-7, and the Russian Cosmos series of space vehicles and satellites come under this category. France recently accused Russia on spying on their satellite, providing secure information to the military. This Russian satellite did a very close approach, and this Russian satellite had very advanced listening capabilities to the French satellite. So it becomes essential, therefore, to possess tools to verify intended purposes for such satellites. The trend towards weaponization of space are also getting formalized with the setting up of a separate strategic support force in China. The Chinese set it up in 2015 with responsibilities for space, cyber, and electronic warfare. Recently, the United States has created a sixth command force called the Space Force with exclusive responsibility for all combat operations in space. In this state of overcrowded space, increasing military capabilities in space, what should India's approach be to safeguard its current and growing space assets? So there's a technology element coming in terms of what you're going to do. There's an international, this one, with whom we can now interact, cooperate, and collaborate. So the first and foremost is the knowledge of what is going on in space. That is, constant information is necessary regarding which are the objects in space, what are the new ones being launched, which orbits do they populate, what are their functions, are they in steady orbits or do they change or maneuver in space, is any one of them on a collision path, assessing and judging which of the activities like close proximity passes are intentional or benign would be a prime requirement. The space situation, or such is called knowledge, is the space situation awareness, is therefore an important component requiring urgent technological and organizational attention. SSA in its broadest sense translates to knowledge of happenings in our near-Earth environment, and the components include acquiring positional data, metrics of space objects and cataloging, space weather monitoring, space surveillance and tracking, conjunction assessment and collision avoidance, and assessing the intent of activities in space. India needs to set up a mechanism. We hear from others, actually the US, NORAD, the North American, this one through their space situational network, they provide surveillance network. They provide data worldwide about many of the objects in this one. We have to depend on this one, and we have no independent means. So in terms of foreign policy interventions, possibility of an agreement, and what we get is not necessarily the most accurate data. For obtaining higher accuracy data and or data sharing arrangement with Russia or some other agencies could be useful till we build up our own capability. It is essential for India to rapidly reduce this dependence on foreign sources for information on all above aspects. In Sriharikota, in the Satish Dhawan Space Center, there is a multi-object tracking radar. This radar is used essentially to support the launch activity. Is there a satellite likely to be in a collision path, and therefore either delay the launch or adjust the launch window? But we need much more. There's a major enhancement of capacity is needed, including employment of optical tracking systems. In the interim, more collaborative and cooperative arrangements with countries can be carried out. Satellite tracking capacity in southern hemisphere is extremely limited, and collaboration, cooperation with countries like Australia, Japan, and US would be a useful scientific and diplomatic outcome. What does one do with data on thousands of space objects? The technical assessment of data can give pointers related to geopolitical and foreign policy implications. Lost satellites can be traced and their paths analyzed to see dangers of collision. This can be provided as a service to others, either on payment basis or gratis, depending on our conditions. Most importantly, advance notice of probable collision can help in planning evasive action and assist in deciphering the intention behind a closed pass. Diplomatic channels of event reporting, event consequences, compensation, arbitration, and liability assignment can be opened up. More importantly, in my opinion, the student community can be harnessed. International student community need not be just our own, this one, to analyze the space object data. orbital dynamics, trajectory defining, satellite life prediction, collision analysis, satellite blind zones are some of the topics where the student community can be engaged. Additionally, the universities can set up ground stations and monitor satellite passes for enhancing the space object data analysis. There are not many amateur astronomers and satellite observers in this country. I would strongly suggest we make an attempt to grow this tribe. The bonanza will be a rich data, its interpretation for various research purposes, international collaboration, and at the same time catching early on satellite maneuvers and raising required precautionary alerts. In terms of international relations engagement, India has space-related MOUs with more than 30 countries and 4 multinational bodies. India is also a member of the International Astronautical Federation and the Asia-Pacific Regional Space Agency Forum. From a technology recipient country, India has graduated to bring its technology capability to the table, and today is more of a technology sharing partner. We are in a rapidly changing environment with implications for technology and international relations. People behind companies like SpaceX, Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, Origin are rewriting the rules of the game. Today, PSLV is a low-cost launch vehicle. If you want to capture more market, we have to increase the capacity more. ISRO is doing that, but I think we need to do it much more aggressively. And it is estimated with PSLV it costs about $4,000 to put 1 kg of payload in low Earth orbit. Elon Musk's Falcon 9, by comparison, could do the job at a lower cost, $2,700. Additionally, the vehicle could haul nearly 23 tons into low Earth orbit as compared to 3 tons by PSLV. This is both an advantage and a disadvantage. Musk will have to wait till he collects 23 tons of payload before he can launch, whereas PSLV need not wait that long. It has only 3.8 tons to collect, and it is still a low-cost vehicle. But currently, the advantage PSLV has is it does approximately, leaving out Musk's and the other reusable type of vehicles, it can do the job at almost 1/4 the cost of the USA. Yeah. But payload sometimes, I think the US vehicles can launch more payload. US brings in certain other constraints. Non-commercial satellites they allow to be launched by PSLV. But on commercial satellites they have said no unless ISRO signs a commercial launch transport agreement with them. They feel ISRO's costs are low because they are highly subsidized, which is not the case, but I think this is where the international relations could be looked at. How we price, we are not really subsidizing the pricing, and how do we compete. The US satellite market would be interested in a low-cost launch, and but this agreement still comes in a way. Side by side, the military dimensions of space are also growing. Number of constellations with optical and radar-based sensors is keeping constant vigil on activities on the ground and seas. Not all satellites, especially the military ones, are registered. Even if they are registered, their function is kept ambiguous. Both US and China, as I've already described, have restructured their space commands. The Chinese will depend heavily upon space infrastructure for exercising their anti-access area denial capabilities. They have also factored in cyber and electronic warfare in their new force structure. The US, on the other hand, has created a structure that will provide strategic leadership for fighting and deterring wars in space. They want to dominate space, and in the process, both these countries may even go in for denial of space to other people. The government of India has recently moved to set up a tri-service organization to handle critical domains of cyberspace, space, and space operations. I think we really need to look at how exactly we progress on this and ensure access to space is by no means denied to us and other countries. Security of space assets, space operations in this environment will be testing. An idea of global space traffic management is being talked, and to find common ground will be the challenges for the countries involved. How much time do I have? Okay, in that case I just want to mention one thing. The unmanned air systems are coming into a big way, but there are a lot of policy items that we need to look at. Many of the air defense systems have been made for the larger systems. So smaller drones, micro air vehicles can penetrate the air defense systems. And whereas you have good purposes also behind, the non-state actors also could take advantage of the situation. For transferring drugs, for transferring small munitions, all these things, the unmanned air systems can be. And the challenge is how do you merge the civil airspace and the small airspace for this type of this one is going to be the major this one. The norms for design, development, air traffic management, okay, will have to really be taken care of. And the disruptive nature, how exactly you manage, will be the major this one. This one is the cyber security. Countries like United States, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Israel have developed and practiced cyber tools to disrupt production processes and disrupt elections, transfer funds fraudulently from banks, steal key technologies, military plans, cause electric grid failures. The cybercrime comes with a strong measure of deniability, and it is difficult to pinpoint the origin of crime. Only if you can quickly identify the perpetrator and take retaliatory action, you will have some this one. Otherwise, one is open to a lot of this one. Hackers have been at it, and I understand, or I have read about, saying that North Korea's cyber attacks in a number of places, about a fifth of their attacks, their hackers or their servers are located in India. This is a little bit disturbing as such. One other aspect I just want to touch is in 2016, North Korea had a series of Musudan launch failures, missile launch failures. 7 out of the 8 missiles launched between April and October either failed on the launch pad or few seconds into flight. The string of failures on a working system was unprecedented, and US hand was suspected in the failures. The question that arises is to what extent are our missile and space systems insulated from such attacks? Aspects of vulnerability and resilience system is generally talked about as necessity, but we will be able to deter such attacks only if we are capable of not only withstanding an attack, but pay back in equal and more measure. This is a sensitive subject and very rightly cannot be a topic of speculation or open discussion. But keeping in mind the proliferation of missiles, weapons technology, one need not be surprised if even in the cyber area we face similar situations. The pace of technology and the growth of technology is unprecedented today. While strategy is often the driver of technology, in the prevailing environment we are extracting strategy from new technologies. The military is already examining the artificial intelligence, how do we use it. As always, I don't know what type of further disruptive applications can emerge from this. So whereas the technology leads, policy and regulations always lag. If some attention can be paid to reduce or eliminate the lag, perhaps there will be more acceptable do's and don'ts of technology application. In today's multipolar world, making this happen would be quite a challenge for international relations. One, however, tends to be optimistic. At least I tend to be optimistic. Despite ups and downs, despite disagreements, despite lack of regard for international convention, the world in general has not only survived, but done well. New technologies are coming in, new applications are coming in, but I think at the same time we should not let down our guard. There are a number of spillovers, and in this spillover, the bad elements quite often win. How do we keep them under control? How do you keep your eyes open? How do you put in this one? What would be the best this one? I'd just like to borrow a phrase from Max Ehrmann from his Desiderata. He says, with all its sham, drudgery, and broken dreams, it is still a beautiful world. I believe we should be our common endeavor to keep the world beautiful. Thank you for your patient listening. Pardon?
Professor, at what stage at which the technology is going, will it impel and compel the world to come together? Because I think in 10 years we're reaching a time that total destruction is on the horizon.
It's very difficult to answer, especially in a time frame. You've seen the conference on disarmament has been going on, and nothing has happened much. On total nuclear disarmament, people have talked. Nobody has given up hope. The leading countries have reduced their weapons, but nobody is going towards zero nuclear stocks. The hypersonic glide missile which I talked about, maybe if you start acting on it, maybe one element perhaps could be stopped. But there are countries which have already advanced further than us. So I'm not so optimistic that we will reach such a situation. Technology will keep growing, but the good aspects of technology may perhaps overtake. GPS, for example, it's become such a common usage. I don't think America can stop GPS or jam the receiver under this one. But they have tools available to say, all right, such and such a country at a particular time I can jam a receiver. But the commercial uses of the GPS has increased so much you can't shut it off. Now the other competitions coming in, interoperability. So many of these technologies will go more into the commercial area, and therefore less chances of it becoming this one. But totally, I am not so optimistic that things will work out the way we would like them to work out. And putting a time frame is all the more difficult.
If I may add, my question actually goes beyond this, especially your own opinion. At what stage will technology reach a point when everybody in the world knows that destruction is upon us? Not being being impelled to do so by the level of what technology has reached. Destruction.
I think one could, nuclear if you take, you reached a particular this one, there are a number of more nuclear powers, but everybody knows, all right, it's good to have it, but not bad to use it. I don't know what other technology can. Artificial intelligence, we are talking about, all the good things we are talking about. At some time, I don't know what will impel. I am unable to really put an answer to that question.
Sir, you spoke about our total space assets being equal to about $100 billion. So that is roughly in today's, the rupee has been falling, so about 100,000 crores. So that's a huge amount of asset. So we don't have similar assets in the oil and gas industry, or, that amount of asset creation. How did it happen? How did you come to that conclusion that we have $100 million worth of space assets?
For the earlier 2010 estimate, we looked at how many transponders we had. We had about 211 transponders. And when we lease out a transponder, we were paying about $1 million per transponder. So we had an estimate of that variety available.
So you have a fantastic return on investment in
Yeah, we have invested. That I have not looked at it.
Would you say that the return on investment would be much more than if you put it in any other
I have not looked at the numbers, but there is the return on investment is, in India, government uses many of its own resources.
True.
I don't know how do you account for it. When Doordarshan uses it, when the other government structures through this one uses it, okay? Whereas the others in the US, there's a commercial return, plenty of it there. So the assessment has been made. I mean, in a sense, we still have this one. I just looked at the 2010 assessment, the number of space objects we had, and in 2018, what is the numbers we have. So just approximately said it may be of that order. But we need to do a much more clearer arithmetic on it and add to it.
So this last question, when it came to nuclear technology, delivery system, etc., you had time in your hand. Time could be probably measured in a decade or a couple of decades, 5 years at least. Those kind of components of time you had. But when it comes to this 5th generation technology, the ones that you're talking about towards the end, when you're talking about space technology, when you're talking about cyber technology, when you're talking about artificial intelligence, are you in a position, or will your research eventually lead to a point where you can tell us how far behind are we from other countries, and how long is it going to take us to be able to come to being at par, and what kind of investments are going to be required? So if that kind of research is available, then we can, it will probably help in policy intervention.
I agree with you. I think bulk of the research in India is subcritically funded. By all matters, this one, US still is the technology leader. Bulk of the ideas come from the US, not even Europe. It's mostly from the US ideas come. All the others are followers. China, the amount of money they are spending, the number of researchers, they are trying to catch up very fast. We are way behind in our thinking and putting our action together. Many of our, thinking is still in silos. We have not changed that. I think unless China has done that very beautifully, they are able to work across disciplines, and number of departments can come together to think and promote an idea. We still have not mastered that. This is one major disadvantage for us. Second thing is the subcritical funding. I think if the funding is certain, therefore we can't obviously fund every technology. If you say this is the technology which requires priority funding and put more effort both in this one. In my own personal opinion, the IT boom has done a lot of damage in terms of we have ignored science, we have ignored manufacturing, and money is too much in the IT for not so much challenging jobs. So some correction perhaps in that is also required to be done, because most of our good talent, if they are doing the science, they go abroad. Other IT, this one absorbs, still continues to absorb, even though it's come down. And I don't know with AI whether things will go into a new this one. So there are areas, but we need to increase funding.
I just had a question, sir. You mentioned about involving the student community in the analysis of space object data, and then you mentioned about orbital dynamics, trajectory, refining, all that. Now this is, I think, a brilliant idea, because it will bring an entire change in the scientific thinking dynamics in the country. If students get involved in this, in the sky blue kind of area. But don't you think this has to be married with our education policy, which is at the moment going haywire? I mean, one has to think in terms of a holistic view. So and then you mentioned about IT, how IT has produced duds. I mean, it's a kind of. I'm probably going against the current thinking, but it's in fact there was a lot of discussion earlier that these call centers and all will be stunting an entire generation of growing up. So how do you react to that?
I agree with you, Zal. I don't know how to react. I feel we need to invest. Actually, the student community should be brought around to doing this type of thing. It must be challenged. And they will take it up if there's money. There's this one. Today's youngsters are full of confidence. They are not dependent on government jobs. They have liked to this one. I have found a couple of youngsters coming and talking whether they can start a launch vehicle development project in the country. They want to develop a small satellite launch vehicle. But policy, regulation, all these elements, unless you look at Who's going to say, all right, you can launch from this place or that place or which place? What safety this one? Who's going to carry this? So those elements, unless all elements of it fall into place, it won't work. Just like you say, it's a good idea to get the students involved in all this, looking at the space object data which comes in. But then how do you really unite them? How do you connect it with the education policy? Needs to be done. We gave a similar idea with regard to certain seismic this one. There's a lot of seismic data coming in. But NGRA has seismic data. The Geological Survey, they have seismic data. Atomic Energy has seismic data. They all look at themselves. And the number of seismic stations we have, perhaps we need to quadruple. And there are also a lot of this one. And if Atomic Energy agrees to sanitize some of the data and pass it on to the student community, all this, there can, a lot of things can be done of a similar nature. But we need a policy change in our thinking outlook.
Okay, one more question. Sorry, maybe two more. One.
Professor Nagappa, there are some experts who feel that the future wars might be fought in cyberspace, and you touched upon cybersecurity. In fact, they also feel that cybersecurity will eventually be linked with space technology, so it's a rather slippery slope. In a realm of cyberspace where there are no boundaries, how do you think the evolution of cyberspace will affect foreign relations? Thank you.
I am not I accept whatever I read, a little bit of what I understand is all I can talk about. The Chinese were known to have hacked into a lot of industrial secrets. Their cyber hacking essentially seems to not to disrupt anything but to steal technology, steal this one. But at a particular time, I think the Americans said enough is enough, and Americans and Chinese, they talked to each other and said what they cannot do, what they can do. Some sort of an agreement happened, because Americans can have the capability to retaliate in some fashion or the other. So they have come to some agreement all right, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Are we in a position to do the same thing? I don't know. As I said, it's a bit difficult for me to say. I really don't know what is the status of the Indian spy this one is. Long time back, I had asked one of my interns to have a look at this one, and he said, on cyber teaching, cyber force generation, what type of capability China has, what type of capability America has displayed. We don't have a university which offers course in cyber. That type of technology asset, the cyber strategy part of it. Creating of a cyber force, we don't have formal this one. I'm sure there are people who are trained who can do it. So we should be in a position, when we are talking with some of the people, they said, even in America, if a cyber crime happens, and if you take 6 months, 8 months, 1 year to find out who did it, its effect is gone. Even they are unable to put it as an international relation into this one. So how fast can you say, you are the guy who did it, therefore we're going to take action on you? So it's a bit far away, it has to be done, but how it's going to evolve, I think it needs much more thinking, and perhaps I'm not the most competent person to talk about it either.
Well, Professor...
Vijay, I'm scared of your question.
I know, but I just thought this, I need to also represent something. So, just as a point, I belong to ISSB, so I'm not going to ask anything difficult. But the privatization, you touched so briefly on it, and perhaps, it'll be very useful for us to know whether what you envisage, a government-private partnership, in expanding both our capabilities, our influences, commercial, non-commercial, getting around that problem, and so on. So that's number one. The other one is also, we had some discussions, if you remember, on making it smaller and most effective, cost-effective. Is the private way the better way, Or should the governments continue to do what they're doing and keep this problem of silos and everything else, It's commercialization, if it's good, like weaponization, commercialization is the other arm. So how are we going to approach that?
I think ISRO is currently doing what it should have done about 15, 20 years back. And I wish other R&D departments follow the same trend. What ISRO seems to be doing is, I'm going to concentrate on the manned space program, and other things which I have already developed, I'm going to ask industry to do it. I think this is a good, I feel this should have been done about 10, 15 years back. But other departments have not done this to the same extent. Some may have done, maybe agriculture, I don't know. So if that is done, there's one. Space, coming to this one, we have interacted. I think there are 15 small companies at least, many of them around Bangalore, a few around Chennai. Some of them are already building small satellites for companies abroad. One person who started this one, he said, I'm going to register my company in Singapore, but use the brainware as well as the hardware from India. So why should he go and register in Singapore? Just because our rest of the regulations, policy and all that's not fallen in place. In Anna University, they made a small satellite. So this is supposed to be launched by an American launch vehicle. So there's difficulty in saying that, all right, where did you get this solar cell from? I got it from ISRO. Where did ISRO get it from? Is it for one of their programs, or did they buy it and give you? So a little bit of how do you hedge and things like there's a little bit of policy, because if you're given an end-use certificate, you're supposed to use it for that end alone. You can't give it to somebody else. And who is going to bear the liability for that launch? Is Government of India going to be liable through ISRO? This part of it is not clear. Who is going to pay the insurance for it? University is not rich enough to pay the insurance part. So these issues of frequency allocation, again you have to go through ISRO. So unless you identify, even in ISRO, Department X is going to channel as a single window all these international regulations and norms, it becomes difficult. So those elements have not fallen in slot. Private guys are interested, many of them are already doing it, they're finding ways around. If that can be streamlined, it will help a lot. And I presume same thing will happen to other DRDO and DAE type of technologies.
May I make a comment, please?
Yes, please. Oh, you would be the deaf.
Well, India counts for one of the big six in space. We are the only country that does not have an industrial space complex as yet. So how we are going to do all of these? ISRO cannot do everything. It just simply cannot have the capacity to turn out what is required in the current context. So unless the inspiration comes from Department of Space or the central government actually, which is Niti Aayog or whatever is the agency, which is responsible for planning for the country and not only for a department and its requirements, I don't think we are getting ahead. And there is a very robust, and you know that very well, the whole new space that is happening. All these young people are in fact going and incorporating companies abroad. Then they get recognition there, and then we say, oh, bravo, come back here, help us to solve our problems. Why?
We need to solve the problems, I agree. That's all, I have no answer. There is a problem, it's pity. It's a pity, we need to correct this situation. Thank you.
Then, in the end, I would like to thank all the speakers. In particular, I would like to thank Ambassador Man Singh for suggesting that the 2017 prize should be related to science. I would like to thank Dr. Siddharth for helping us in so many ways in arranging this function. Dr. Chari for finding time for us in his busy schedule, and Dr. Nagappa for a brilliant lecture. And thank you all of you for coming. There are many programs that happen in Delhi, so to come to this function, thank you very much.